"You're not helping, Evelyn. You're just a burden with an apron." My daughter-in-law said it so casually that for a moment I wondered if I had imagined it. The words floated across the dining room and settled over the table like dust. No one gasped. No one objected. The only sound was the soft clink of silverware against ceramic plates. I stood there holding a casserole dish that was still warm from the oven. Steam curled upward between us. My son Michael stared down at his mashed potatoes as if they required his full attention. I waited for him to say something. Anything. A laugh. A correction. A simple, "That's not true." But nothing came. I had spent nearly 3 hours preparing that Sunday dinner. The roast had been slow cooking since noon. The green beans were seasoned the way Michael liked them when he was a boy. The apple pie cooling on the kitchen counter was made from a recipe that had been in our family for 40 years. I looked around the room and suddenly realized something painful. No one noticed any of it anymore. Not the meals. Not the effort. Not me. 8 months earlier, my husband Thomas had passed away after a long illness. We had been married for 46 years. After the funeral, I told myself the best thing I could do was stay busy. So every morning, I drove 15 miles across town to Michael's house. I helped with laundry. I picked up groceries. I watched the children after school. I cooked dinners so my son and his wife could focus on work and family. At least that was what I believed I was doing. Looking back, maybe I was trying to hold on to a family that had already started letting go of me. Brittany took a sip of iced tea and shrugged. "I'm just being honest." She didn't even sound angry. Somehow that made it worse. Honest. As if kindness had become dishonest. As if gratitude had become optional. I carefully set the casserole dish on the table. My hands were steady. That surprised me. Inside, I felt something shifting, like a foundation cracking beneath a house that had stood for decades. "Excuse me," I said quietly. Michael finally glanced up. For a second, I saw discomfort in his eyes. Maybe even guilt. But he looked away almost. Immediately. That hurt more than Brittany's comment ever could. I untied my apron and folded it neatly. The fabric was faded blue with tiny white flowers. Thomas had bought it for me years ago during a weekend trip to Vermont. "You always look happiest in the kitchen," he had told me. Back then, those words felt like love. Now they felt like a memory from another lifetime. I placed the folded apron over the back of a chair and walked toward the kitchen. No one stopped me. Behind me, conversation slowly resumed. They talked about vacation plans, school schedules, home renovations. Life moved forward with remarkable speed when you were no longer considered important. Standing alone beside the sink, I stared through the window into the darkening backyard. The maple trees swayed gently in the evening breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. But for the first time since Thomas died, I began to wonder whether the family I had spent my life caring for was quietly planning a future that no longer included me. The next morning, I woke up at 5:30, the same time I had for nearly 30 years. Old habits stay long after the reasons for them disappear. For a few moments, I lay still and listened to the silence inside my house. There was no coffee brewing downstairs. No newspaper rustling at the kitchen table. No soft voice asking if I wanted eggs or toast. Thomas had been gone for 8 months, yet some mornings my mind still expected him to be there. I got up, made a simple breakfast, and stood by the window overlooking the backyard. The bird feeder Thomas built years ago still hung from the oak tree. A pair of cardinals landed on it, bright red against the pale morning sky. Watching them should have brought comfort. Instead, I felt an emptiness I could not ignore anymore. For months, I had filled every hour helping Michael and Brittany. If I stayed busy enough, I did not have to sit with my grief. I did not have to think about the empty chair across from me. I did not have to face how much my life had changed. Around 7 o'clock, I loaded groceries into my car as I always did on Mondays. Milk, bread, fruit, cereal for the children, and the coffee Brittany preferred. Halfway through placing the bags in the trunk, I stopped. My hands rested on the handle of a paper sack filled with apples. A strange question entered my mind. When was the last time anyone had asked how I was doing? I stood there for nearly a minute trying to remember. The answer never came. At Michael's house, the garage door was open. Brittany's SUV sat inside. I carried the groceries to the kitchen. No one looked up when I entered. Brittany was scrolling through her phone. Michael was typing on a laptop at the counter. The grandchildren were eating breakfast. I smiled and greeted everyone. The children smiled back. The adults barely acknowledged me. I began putting groceries away. It was a small thing, but I noticed Brittany had cleared out an entire cabinet where I normally stored baking supplies. My mixing bowls were gone. My pie dishes had disappeared. Even the container of cinnamon I always kept there was missing. I reorganized the kitchen, Brittany said without looking up. I needed more space. I nodded. It was her kitchen, after all. Still, something about it felt deliberate. Later that afternoon, while folding towels in the laundry room, I overheard voices drifting from the home office down the hall. The door was partially closed. I was not trying to listen. Their conversation simply carried through the quiet house. "We have to think long-term," Brittany said. "Things cannot keep going like this forever." Michael sighed heavily. "I know. The house is getting crowded. The expenses are adding up." There was a pause. "She is alone now," Brittany continued. "Maybe it is time to start discussing other options." I froze with a towel in my hands. Other options. The words sounded harmless. Reasonable, even. Yet something cold settled in my chest. Michael did not argue. He did not defend me. He simply remained silent. A few minutes later, I quietly finished folding the laundry and placed the towels in the linen closet. No one noticed how pale I felt. No one asked why I left earlier than usual that day. As I drove home through the late afternoon traffic, I could not stop hearing Brittany's voice. Other options. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I realized something that frightened me more than her words. For the first time, I was beginning to believe she had already made a plan. For the rest of that week, I paid closer attention than I had in months. Not because I wanted to be suspicious. I simply could not ignore the feeling that something important was happening around me while everyone assumed I would never notice. Small things began to stand out. Michael stopped discussing family finances when I entered a room. Brittany would quickly close her laptop whenever I walked past the kitchen table. More than once, I noticed papers spread across the counter that disappeared moments later. None of it was enough to prove anything. Yet together, the pieces formed a picture I did not like. On Thursday afternoon, I arrived at the house earlier than usual. The grandchildren were still at school, and Brittany was upstairs on a work call. Michael's car was parked in the driveway. As I stepped through the front door, I heard his voice coming from the dining room. He was speaking with someone on speakerphone. I was about to announce myself when a sentence stopped me. "I just want to understand what the process would look like." His voice sounded tense. A man answered, "Every situation is different. It depends on her assets, health, and level of independence." I froze. Independence. Assets. The words immediately caught my attention. Michael lowered his voice, but I could still hear enough to understand the conversation was about housing options for older adults. My heart sank. I quietly stepped back outside before either of them noticed me. Sitting in my car, I stared through the windshield for several minutes. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe Michael was gathering information for someone else. Yet deep down, I already knew the truth. The conversation fit too perfectly with everything Brittany had been saying. That evening, I returned home feeling exhausted. The house felt unusually quiet. I made myself a cup of tea and carried it into the living room. Across from my favorite chair stood a bookshelf Thomas had built with his own hands. My eyes settled on a framed photograph taken 15 years earlier. Michael stood between us at a 4th of July picnic, smiling with an arm around each parent. We looked like one of those families people put on holiday cards. Looking at that photograph now, I wondered when things had started changing. The answer came slowly. Not all at once. It happened through 100 tiny moments. Brittany deciding holidays should rotate elsewhere. Brittany planning family outings without telling me. Brittany speaking for Michael more and more often until eventually I could not remember the last time he had made a major decision without her approval. I was not blaming her for everything. Michael was a grown man. Yet I could not ignore the pattern. One Friday morning, I found a large envelope from a senior care planning company in my mailbox. At first, I assumed it was ordinary advertising. Companies send those brochures all the time. But when I opened it, I discovered something different. Inside was a personalized packet discussing housing options, transportation assistance, and long-term lifestyle planning. My name appeared on the cover page. Attached to the packet was a note referencing a recent information request. Someone had apparently inquired about available services on my behalf. There was no signature, only a customer reference number. Perhaps it was harmless. Perhaps someone was simply gathering information. Yet as I held those papers in my hands, I could not ignore the timing. The packet arrived only days after I overheard conversations about housing options and future arrangements. For the first time, I stopped wondering whether plans were being made. I began wondering how far those plans had already gone. I stared at the page. I had never authorized any changes. Maybe it was an administrative mistake. Maybe there was another explanation. But as I held those papers in my hands, the uneasy feeling that had followed me all week hardened into certainty. Someone was making plans for my future. The most disturbing part was that no one had bothered to include me in the conversation. That afternoon, I pulled a dusty wooden box from the top shelf of my bedroom closet. I had not opened it since the week after Thomas passed away. The box was simple, made of oak, with brass hinges that had darkened over the years. Thomas kept important papers there: insurance documents, property records, old photographs, and letters he never wanted misplaced. I carried it to the dining room table and sat down beneath the same chandelier we had picked out together nearly 20 years earlier. Sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor as I carefully lifted the lid. The familiar scent of old paper immediately brought back memories. For a moment, I simply sat there looking at his handwriting on a stack of neatly labeled folders. Thomas had always been organized. He believed preparation was a form of love. Take care of things before they become problems, he used to say. At the time, I thought he was talking about leaking roofs and retirement accounts. Now I wondered if he had meant something much deeper. I spent the next hour sorting through documents. Most were exactly what I expected: tax returns, property assessments, bank statements. Then I found a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting. My heart skipped. The envelope looked old, as though it had been waiting for me for a very long time. I opened it carefully. Inside was a short letter. Thomas wrote that if I was reading it, circumstances had probably changed in ways neither of us wanted. He reminded me that I was stronger than I believed. He also instructed me to contact a man named Harold Bennett if I ever had questions about our family affairs. Beneath the note was a business card. I immediately recognized the name. Harold Bennett had been our attorney for years. He handled estate planning and legal paperwork whenever Thomas needed advice. I had not spoken to him since the funeral. I stared at the card for several minutes. Part of me felt foolish. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe there was a simple explanation for everything. Yet another part of me remembered the conversation about housing options, the hidden paperwork, the sudden changes, the uneasy silences whenever I entered a room. By the following morning, curiosity outweighed hesitation. I called the number on the card. To my surprise, Mr. Bennett answered personally. His voice sounded older than I remembered, but just as steady. When I explained who I was, he became very quiet. Then he asked if I could come to his office the next day. There was something in his tone that immediately caught my attention. It was not alarm. It was not urgency. It sounded more like relief. The next afternoon, I drove 30 minutes into town. Mr. Bennett's office occupied the second floor of a red brick building near the courthouse. The waiting room looked exactly the same as it had years earlier. Framed certificates lined the walls. A grandfather clock ticked softly in the corner. When he greeted me, his expression was warm but thoughtful. After a few minutes of polite conversation, he folded his hands across his desk and looked directly at me. "Evelyn," he said carefully, "before we discuss anything else, I need to ask a question. Has anyone recently been encouraging you to make major decisions about your living arrangements, finances, or personal independence?" The room suddenly felt very still. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I thought about Brittany. I thought about Michael. I thought about every strange moment from the past several weeks. Then I slowly nodded. Mr. Bennett leaned back in his chair. His expression did not show surprise. If anything, it suggested he had been expecting exactly that answer. Mr. Bennett opened a thick folder and slowly turned it toward me. Inside were documents bearing Thomas's signature, along with dates spanning nearly a decade. I recognized several of the papers immediately. Others were completely unfamiliar. "Your husband was very thorough," Mr. Bennett said. He believed that protecting family required planning ahead. I sat quietly as he explained. Years earlier, Thomas had established a trust designed to safeguard our assets and ensure that major decisions remained under my control for the rest of my life. The family home, several investment accounts, and other financial resources had all been structured in ways I never fully understood because Thomas handled those matters himself. I listened carefully, feeling both grateful and unsettled. Grateful because Thomas had clearly thought about my future. unsettled because I suddenly realized there was much more happening beneath the surface than I had imagined. Mr. Bennett continued reviewing the documents one by one. Then he paused. "There is something else you should know." He reached for another folder. "About 6 weeks ago, someone contacted my office requesting information about your trust." My stomach tightened. "Who?" I asked. Mr. Bennett adjusted his glasses and looked down at the paperwork. "Your son and daughter-in-law." For several seconds, I simply stared at him. The office seemed unusually quiet. Outside the window, traffic moved through the afternoon streets. Somewhere down the hall, a printer hummed softly. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. What did they want? I finally asked. Mr. Bennett chose his words carefully. They were interested in understanding what authority they might have regarding future decisions involving your residence and finances. I felt a heaviness settle in my chest. Not because they had asked questions. Questions alone meant very little. What troubled me was that no one had mentioned the conversation to me. No one had invited me to participate. No one had respected me enough to speak honestly. Mr. Bennett folded his hands. "I declined to provide information without your authorization." I nodded slowly. A wave of relief washed over me. At least someone had remembered I still existed. As the meeting continued, more pieces began falling into place. The insurance forms. The discussions about housing. The paperwork that appeared and disappeared whenever I entered a room. Suddenly, those incidents no longer felt disconnected. They felt organized. Deliberate. Not necessarily malicious, but deliberate. Before leaving, I asked Mr. Bennett a question that had been troubling me all week. "Do you think they are trying to push me out?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and considered the question. "I think," he said carefully, "that some people become very comfortable making plans for others when they assume those others will never." Object. The statement stayed with me long after our meeting ended. During the drive home, I replayed every conversation from the past several months. Every time Brittany spoke on Michael's behalf. Every time Michael avoided difficult discussions. Every time I ignored my own instincts because I wanted peace. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the lawn. I sat in the car for several minutes, looking at the house Thomas and I had built together. For the first time since his death, I felt something besides grief. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was clarity. Someone had been quietly making decisions about my future. They assumed I would never notice. What they did not realize was that I had finally started paying attention. The following week, I changed nothing on the surface. I still drove to Michael's house. I still brought groceries. I still helped the children with homework and packed leftovers into containers for the refrigerator. If Brittany noticed any difference, she did not show it. In fact, she seemed more relaxed than usual. Looking back, I think she believed her plans were moving exactly as expected. That assumption became her biggest mistake. Once I understood what was happening, I stopped reacting emotionally and started observing. People reveal a great deal when they think no one is paying attention. On Tuesday morning, I arrived with a tray of blueberry muffins. Brittany greeted me with unusual warmth. She complimented my sweater. She asked about my weekend. She even offered me coffee before quickly shifting the conversation toward retirement communities she had recently discovered online. "Some of them are absolutely beautiful," she said while scrolling through photographs on her phone. "Private apartments. Activities every day. Restaurant-style dining." I smiled politely and took a sip of coffee. "That sounds lovely," I replied. The surprise on her face lasted only a second. She had expected resistance. Instead, I gave her agreement. From that moment forward, she became more confident. Over the next several days, she mentioned similar topics repeatedly. Smaller homes. Easier. Lifestyles. Fewer responsibilities. Every suggestion sounded carefully rehearsed. Michael rarely contributed. He simply listened while Brittany guided the discussion. The silence from my son continued to hurt, but it no longer confused me. I had finally accepted that silence was also a choice. On Thursday afternoon, an opportunity presented itself. Brittany left her laptop open on the kitchen island while she answered a phone call upstairs. I was not searching through her belongings. I merely glanced at the screen while placing groceries on the counter. What I saw made me stop. On Thursday afternoon, Brittany left several printed pages on the kitchen island while she stepped upstairs to take a phone call. I was unloading groceries when I noticed them. I had no intention of reading private papers, but one page had been left face up. Across the top were headings such as estimated home value, future housing costs, renovation budget, and mortgage scenarios. Beneath them were rows of calculations and notes. I immediately recognized the address listed on the page. It was my home. I looked away after only a few seconds. There was nothing illegal or shocking about the document itself. People plan budgets all the time. What unsettled me was the assumption hidden inside those numbers. The calculations seemed to be built around a future in which my house would no longer belong solely to me. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The brochures rested beside my dinner plate like place cards at a carefully arranged event. Brittany folded her hands and smiled. It was the same smile she used whenever she believed she had already won an argument before it began. Michael sat quietly across from me. He looked uncomfortable, but he did not stop what was happening. By then, I had stopped expecting him to. "We have been thinking about what is best for everyone," Brittany said gently. "Especially for you." I glanced down at the brochures. Beautiful buildings filled with cheerful retirees appeared on every page. Gardens, walking paths, activity centers. Everything looked pleasant. Everything looked planned. "That is very thoughtful," I said. Brittany blinked. Clearly, she had expected resistance. "You think so?" she asked. "Of course," I replied. "You spent a lot of time preparing this." Her expression relaxed immediately. Across the table, Michael finally looked up. For the first time in weeks, I noticed genuine surprise in his face. They had prepared themselves for objections. Instead, I gave them calm agreement. The conversation continued through dinner. Brittany explained amenities, meal plans, transportation services, and social activities. She spoke as though the decision had already been made. More importantly, she spoke as though I was not fully capable of making it myself. Every few minutes, she slid another brochure closer to me. Every few minutes, I nodded politely. Then she reached for the stack of papers beneath them. "There are also a few documents that would make future planning easier," she said. "Nothing complicated." I looked at the pages. Legal language filled the forms. Financial authorizations. Emergency decision permissions. Various signatures highlighted with yellow tabs. Everything had been organized in advance. Everything except one detail. No one had asked whether I wanted any of it. "I would like some time to review these," I said. Brittany's smile tightened slightly. "There is really no rush," she answered. The statement sounded harmless. Yet the stack of prepared paperwork suggested otherwise. When dinner ended, I gathered my purse and headed toward the front door. The grandchildren hugged me goodbye. Their affection was sincere, uncomplicated, and completely separate from the plans being made by the adults. Before leaving, I glanced back into the kitchen. Brittany was already collecting the brochures. Michael stood beside her speaking quietly. Neither realized I was watching. For a brief moment, they both looked relieved. That was when I understood something important. They believed I had accepted everything. They believed I would eventually sign whatever was placed in front of me. The following morning, I met with Mr. Bennett again. I handed him copies of every document Brittany had given me. He reviewed them carefully. The longer he read, the more serious his expression became. Finally, he set the papers down. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "these forms would give other people significant influence over decisions that currently belong entirely to you." I felt no shock. By then, I expected exactly that. What surprised me was how calm I felt. Weeks earlier, the discovery would have devastated me. Now it simply confirmed what I already knew. Mr. Bennett leaned forward. "Do not sign anything, and do not tell them what you know." I nodded. Outside his office window, autumn leaves drifted across the courthouse lawn. The season was changing. So was something inside me. For months, I had been reacting to events as they happened. Now I finally understood the entire board. And once you understand the game, you stop playing by someone else's rules. The family meeting happened 3 days later. Brittany called it a conversation, but everything about it felt rehearsed. When I arrived that Sunday evening, the dining table had been cleared except for a pitcher of iced tea, a few glasses, and a neatly organized folder sitting in the center. Michael greeted me at the door with an awkward smile. Brittany seemed unusually cheerful. Even before I sat down, I knew they believed the outcome had already been decided. The grandchildren were spending the night with friends, which meant there would be no interruptions and no witnesses. Brittany waited until everyone was seated before opening the folder. "Thank you for coming, Evelyn," she said. Her tone sounded professional, almost businesslike. We have spent a lot of time thinking about what would be best moving forward. I folded my hands in my lap and listened. She spoke for nearly 15 minutes. She talked about convenience, safety, simplicity, community. Every argument pointed toward the same conclusion. According to Brittany, my future would be easier if I moved into one of the retirement communities she had selected. Michael occasionally nodded beside her. He rarely added anything of his own. I noticed that every time Brittany paused, she glanced at him as if expecting confirmation. Eventually, she slid the folder across the table. We took the liberty of preparing everything in advance. I opened the folder slowly. Inside the folder were draft planning documents, informational packets, contact sheets, and several forms marked for future review. None of them were official contracts. None required immediate action. Yet every page pointed toward the same outcome. A move, a transition, a future that had already been outlined without my participation. Sticky notes marked sections Brittany wanted me to read. Several pages contained handwritten reminders about next steps. Looking through the folder, I realized something important. This was not a spontaneous family discussion. It was the final presentation of a plan that had been developing for months. Neither Brittany nor Michael touched the envelope. For several long seconds, they simply stared at it sitting beside their carefully prepared folder. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was gone. In its place was uncertainty. I could see it in the way Brittany's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair. I could hear it in the silence. Finally, Michael cleared his throat. "Mom, what exactly is in that envelope?" I looked at him for a moment before answering. Information that should have been part of this conversation from the beginning. Brittany forced a small laugh. "I am sure there is some misunderstanding." The words sounded familiar. I had heard similar versions for months whenever questions became uncomfortable. But this time, no one seemed convinced by them. I slid the envelope across the table. Michael opened it first. Inside were copies of trust documents, property records, and letters prepared years earlier. He turned the pages slowly. With each page, his expression changed. Confusion gave way to surprise. Surprise became concern. Beside him, Brittany leaned closer, reading over his shoulder. The color gradually faded from her face. "This cannot be right," she said quietly. But it was right. Every document had been reviewed by Mr. Bennett. Every signature had been verified years before. The family home remained under my control. The trust established by Thomas placed major financial decisions entirely in my hands. Certain educational funds for the grandchildren were protected as well. Most importantly, no one could make decisions about my residence, finances, or personal affairs without my direct approval. The room remained silent as the reality settled in. Michael read the documents twice, then a third time. Finally, he looked up. "Dad never told me any of this." I nodded. "Your father trusted that people would do the right thing without needing financial incentives." No one responded. Brittany lowered her eyes to the table. For the first time since this situation began, she seemed unable to find the perfect words. Eventually, Michael spoke again. His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. "Mom, we were only trying to help." I believe part of that statement was true. The problem was that helping had slowly become controlling. Concern had slowly become planning. Somewhere along the way, they stopped treating me like a person and started treating me like a problem to solve. I folded my hands calmly. Helping begins with asking someone what they want. Neither of them argued. Outside, evening sunlight filtered through the dining room windows. The same room where I had cooked countless meals. Birthday dinners, holiday gatherings, Sunday suppers after church. Years of memories seemed to surround us. Yet for the first time in months, I no longer felt invisible inside them. Brittany finally looked at me. "I never meant to hurt you." The apology sounded sincere. Perhaps it was. But sincerity arriving late does not erase everything that came before it. I offered a small nod. Nothing more. There was no victory in that moment. No celebration. Only clarity. After a while, I stood and gathered my purse. Michael rose from his chair as though he wanted to stop me. Perhaps he wanted forgiveness. Perhaps he wanted another chance to explain. I smiled gently. "Take care of each other," I said. Then I walked toward the door. No one followed. No one argued. As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I felt lighter than I had in a very long time. The future was still uncertain. Grief still existed. Life would continue changing. But one thing was finally clear. I was never a burden. I was simply a woman who had spent years giving love to people who had forgotten its value. And from that day forward, I intended to remember my own.